When you see a footage of a PS1 game, you know it's a PS1 game. Because it has that iconic look, unless it's an emulator footage with a bunch of fixes enabled. And I will reveal my biggest issue with emulator footage later, but what is it about PS1 graphics that make it stand out so much, especially when compared to the N64? In my opinion, the PS1 look comprises of these three visual artifacts, or graphical imperfections, and I rank them in order of their impact on the overall look. Number 3, and the least important one, is the depth error. The lack of a Z buffer on the PlayStation resulted in the depth of each polygon being calculated using the average Z coordinate of its vertices. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, but the bottom line is that it wasn't very accurate, and that's why in certain scenarios some polygons appear in front of others when they shouldn't. It's the least important one in my opinion because it didn't happen that often, and it was harder to spot it, especially in fast-paced games or games with very simple environments. Warping textures. To map a 2D texture onto a 3D surface, the vertices on the PS1 are projected onto the screen during rendering, and the texture coordinates are then linearly interpolated between them. This method is called affine texture mapping, and it was used on the PS1 because it doesn't require the depth information. So the absence of the depth buffer is also responsible for the dreaded, or beloved, texture warping effect. Can you imagine how much different PS1 games would look if only Sony had added a Z buffer? Would it still look so iconic? It would probably look more like a Sega Saturn game. Wait a minute. No, it can't be. Sega Saturn doesn't have a Z buffer either? What? Wobbling Vertices. Arguably the most iconic graphical artifact is caused by the lack of a floating point unit. Everything is integer based, there are no sub-pixel movements, that's why vertices suddenly snap from one pixel to another. The effect is more pronounced the further the vertex is from the camera. Software emulated floating point operations were possible, but quite expensive. Honorable mention goes to nearest neighbor texture filtering, and while it's very important if you're making a PS1 style game to be played on an LCD monitor, it was barely noticeable back in the day because CRTs hid it so well. Speaking of texture filtering and LCDs, one of my biggest pet peeves is when people enable bilinear texture filtering in emulator settings. Whenever I see footage like that, I say to myself, "You monster, why would you do that?" Anyway, I wanted to know what you guys and girls think, so I created a poll. More than 160 people voted, and here are the results. None of you thought that the depth error is the most iconic graphical artifact, which was a surprise. But maybe it's my fault. Instead of the depth error, I should have called it flickering polygons or something like that. Z-fighting, perhaps? The fourth place goes to dithering, and I didn't include it in my list for the same reason as texture filtering. Something I can't see can't be iconic to me. Texture warping and fog are in close third and second place. I didn't expect fog to be so popular, let alone beat texture warping. To be honest, I added fog to the poll because I had one last slot available, so I thought I'll just throw it in there for fun. In hindsight, I probably should have put the nearest texture filtering instead. More than 50% voted for Wobbling Vertices. So we've established that it's the most iconic graphical imperfection on the PS1, but can it alone trick someone into thinking they're looking at a footage of a PS1 game? I mean, could a CRT footage of an N64 game with wobbling vertices be mistaken for a PS1 game? Assuming it's viewed from a reasonable distance on an average size CRT. I want to hear from you, so vote for it, and thanks for watching.